Hi, this is Jeff Towson from Peking University. This is part 3 of our discussion with Jonathan Woetzel, the urbanization guru of McKinsey. And in this section, part 3, we're going to talk about basically infrastructure. And so my question is, broadly, how does infrastructure change China?
Well, we talked about this, I think, a little bit at the first section. Let me elaborate, because infrastructure is this thing that sometimes people attribute like magical qualities to infrastructure. Build a airport and magically things will happen, and that's not really true. What infrastructure does is it makes your economic activity that much more effective. It lowers your costs, basically. But if you've got no activity, you're still going to have any activity. Even if you build a magical airport. There was an article I read the other day about the world's emptiest airport, which is a Chinese-built airport in Sri Lanka, which literally has grass growing on the runway now and cows and so forth. And like 17 people have ever passed through this thing. And it's so yeah, I mean, you clearly one can do things that are not economic with infrastructure. But that said, if you've got economic activity, or if you've got people who really want to work and they've got some kind of a product, yeah, you put in your infrastructure and it makes them better, makes them more effective, makes them more competitive. So I used to run the McKinsey location in Shanghai, and I'll always remember this. Like 25 years or 20 years ago, we had to fit out the office, and most of the furnishings, first of all, had to be imported from South China, which was effectively importing them. And so we had this truck, and it was started off somewhere in Dongguan. And then you try to keep track of where it was. And there was a storm, and then the road disappeared, and then the truck disappeared. And so you never knew what was going on. And that was pretty typical of a lot of internal logistics in China. And cost of logistics as a share of GDP in China used to be something like 15 or 16%, which was ridiculous. It's like 3x what the US is. And that was the delays, that was the cost of the inventory, that was the management of that. I mean, it was just a real mess. So infrastructure has, of course, improved pretty dramatically. Not everywhere, but a lot. I mean, there's been a huge investment. China's been investing like 9% of GDP every year in infrastructure, compared to global average of around 7 and a US average of around 3. So China's been catching up, you could argue. And now China's more or less at what you'll call a global average of infrastructure stock as a share of GDP. If you add up all the money that's been spent on infrastructure and depreciate it out, it all winds up like being 70% of GDP is been spent on infrastructure that's available today. And that's kind of global average. It's same as US. It's less than a place like Japan. Now, Japan is at 150%. So it just says you can spend too much. Right. But on the other hand, Brazil is at 30. You can spend too little. So China is right there. And the question really is going forward, should it keep spending that much? I mean, do you still want to spend 9% of your GDP? Maybe you can slack off a little bit. Maybe can spend more money on education or on healthcare. But it's been a hardware-led kind of thing.
How do you see the infrastructure plans changing, in addition to sort of aggregate amount, the focus of that money now versus, say, 10 years ago? Are the projects changing? Is it just more of the same?
It's a good question, because I think that we had the golden age of China's national infrastructure. That's been the last 10 years. We had high-speed rail. I mean, no one else has a high-speed rail the way China has a high-speed rail. We have the strong, smart grid. Again, no one else has a strong, smart grid that ships electricity from Inner Mongolia to Shanghai. That doesn't happen anywhere else. And this has all been interurban infrastructure. And we've had the big water projects, the South-North Water Project. It's still ongoing, but there we had the Three Gorges, and then sort of these massive hydroelectric dams that supply, I think, like 6% of China's primary energy is going to come from the Three Gorges. It's incredible. So those projects, they happen once. And once you've built the rail, or once you put out the National Highway Program, then you got it. So what then do you spend the money on? Well, you spend it on the places where people are. You spend it on within the cities. So water treatment, water supply, that's actually a surprisingly big number when you sort of add it all up. And the amount of water that's needed by Chinese citizens as opposed to Chinese agriculture. So Chinese citizens is going to be a dramatic requirement. Obviously power, but what kind of power? And so we see a boom in decentralized energy. So whether it's solar or water or geothermal or tidal, whatever kind of energy you can get locally. I mean, that's big. Of course, with the transmission and distribution of that energy locally. So the grid locally. Transport. I mean, I mentioned this once, the metros. China has had, I think, Shanghai has built, I think it's 800 kilometers of metro in the last 10 years. And now every city in China that's over 1 million or 2 million is going to try to do the same thing. Because it is a mandate, first of all, to do that if you want to allow people to get to work and to live and to have a reasonable commute, you got to have a metro. So that's kind of where I see the majority of the spending going on, is moving away from these national, interurban to more locally funded, intra-city kind of living-related infrastructure opportunities.
And I think that raises the good question of how is this all funded? Is it federal, national, local? I mean, how does the money work within all of this?
First of all, there's a big misperception usually that, somehow the private sector does it all or spends lots of money on it. That's not true. And that's not true anywhere. Globally, infrastructure is largely publicly financed because for the obvious reasons. It's a long-term asset. You have to provide it almost by definition to everybody. Which means that not everybody can pay the price. So you've got a tariff which is set by the regulator, and it requires a lot of. It's very complicated. There are a lot of execution challenges, usually related to land. You got to move people around. So the private sector in general is not interested in taking that kind of risk. Certainly not interested in taking that kind of risk without some public support. So the state has to take the lead on all this stuff. And so over 70% of infrastructure worldwide is funded by the state. In the case of China, it's like 95%. So because the state had the money. I just parentheses, state didn't always have the money. And when the state didn't have the money, it said, we're not going to build the infrastructure. So China did urbanization on the cheap for the first 10 years, the decade of the 80s and early 90s. There wasn't a lot of great infrastructure in China. Driving from Hongqiao Airport to downtown Shanghai, easily 2 hours, because it was like one road and there wasn't a gaojia. So now, of course, China has the money. So the question then is like, why would you cut the private sector in? And where would it make sense? And how would it help? And to their credit, the government has said, yeah, again, we may have overspent a little bit. The 9% might be a little high. So maybe we should use the private sector to help us become more efficient in our spending. And that's where the deals come. The deals come, okay, we're still, as government is, in control, there's a system, but we want to help make this project really work. We want to make it work economically. We want to make it work from a design perspective, environmentally. And we want to be, efficient about it in terms of how we operate it. So where I see it coming in, first of all, water. There's, again, a big, water assets are fixed, you know where they are, and you can run them better. If you have a network and the network is run efficiently, you can stop leakage, you can make sure that the maintenance is done on time, on budget, you can spend less money expanding the system, so there's a real strong economic incentive to do this. And your only question really is tariff. Will the government pay you the money? Because most of the tariff comes through the government. Again, people don't pay market-based water prices in China. No, they don't pay them anywhere. So your risk is about government. So if you can get comfortable with government risk, then you have a huge upside from making the system more efficient. And so from a private investor point of view, that can be worth taking. So we see a lot of investment in water. Grid is a little more difficult because you've got state grid, and it's a huge profitable system, and in general it doesn't play well with others. But on the other hand, maybe you can do decentralized energy where you're working with like a steel plant or somebody else who generates a lot of heat, and then you say, okay, well, I'm going to help use that energy efficiently for the city. And so you partner. So a lot of these things are going to be partnerships at the local level around opportunities to, again, make the system work better, make it work better economically, make it work environmentally. And last point, again, real estate. a huge portion of what infrastructure was going to be built is going to be real estate linked. So transportation, generally speaking, you cannot make money on transportation just by charging for transportation. Metros don't make money. So you cannot recover that capital. Where you capture the money is in the real estate, the real estate specifically around the station. So if you look at the best examples in the world, like Hong Kong, Hong Kong the MTR is a real estate company that happens to have a large metro. But it really works because there's huge value from the commercial point of view in all of that density and all that traffic. You put the station in and boom, all of a sudden, instant shopping mall. and so that's the capture, is any infrastructure that has a real estate linkage, you're going to see a lot of interest from private sector real estate investors to become infrastructure companies.
For infrastructure, what's sort of top of your mind going forward, looking over the next 5 years? What would be on your very short list?
Well, it's all about the tech. I think the tech is going to transform the way we think about infrastructure and what is infrastructure. I mean, I'd argue that Alibaba, or Tencent, this is infrastructure. Digital infrastructure is going to be as, if not more, important than physical. I mean, it's because you can't do without the physical. You still got to be able to get from A to B. But the information that you will need to make the decision of how to use the infrastructure, that's going to be life-preserving. It's going to be necessary. So people will not be comfortable deciding where to go if they can't get information about traffic, if they can't get information about costs, if they can't get information about the availability of the services of where they're going, which will come to them over the digital infrastructure. And so the information they need to make the decision whether, in fact, to take the trip or use the energy source, that's digital. So I think the digital infrastructure is a new and a really interesting platform. And so how that gets used, how that gets regulated, who gets to have access to it, I think that's really cool. And then, of course, I think the physical infrastructure will change. All of our bicycles. We love our bicycles. I mean, and so that's solved last mile. We always said, how do we have solved the last mile problem where we go between the metro station and your home? It can be a mile. You can't put the metro station everywhere. Solved it. We solved it with dockless bikes, at least for people who can ride a bike. And then we're going to see about the autonomous version of that will be for the people who can't ride a bike, and so they get in their little tuk-tuk and it takes them home. So the physical stuff, which is going to be very cool. I mean, I like to talk about dematerialization of the economy, and so we're going to literally see the tech dematerializing parts of the system. So I think autonomous vehicles are case in point. We've dematerialized the driver. The driver's gone. It's now bits and bytes, and so that's that we can extend that, whether it's again the autonomous charging electric flying vehicles or the 3D printed thing that you do at home because you don't actually have to take the trip. You can you print out your whatever your consumer good that you were going to go to buy at the store. Instead, you can print it out at home. There's going to be radical changes.